A lot of women doing sports really, really well.
The story of Michaela Schifrin's game-changing reign at the top of the slopes when we go person to person.
Tonight, we're on the U.S.-Mexico border where a surge in illegal crossings is raising safety concerns. Plus, some batteries that may be around your home are exploding. Tips to protect your family. And bringing sick children magic beyond medicine this holiday season on the CBS Evening News.
In the end, they're not after me, they're after you. I just happen to be standing in their way.
I do not believe Donald Trump should be prevented from being president of the United States by any court. I think he should be prevented from being president of the United States by the voters of this country.
And we've secured the release of every American being held in Venezuela on their way home.
Hello, everyone. I'm Major Garrett in Washington. Welcome to America Decides. Colorado was not a state when Congress passed the 14th Amendment in June of 1866, or when that amendment was ratified 2 summers later. Colorado would not become a state, the 38th in the Union, until August of 1876. America turned 100 that year. That's why Colorado is known as the Centennial State. Colorado has a history of taking voting seriously. It was the first state in the Union to grant universal suffrage. It did that in 1893 by popular vote. That means Colorado was well ahead of the rest of the country in granting women the right to vote, 27 years ahead. The 19th Amendment granting all women in America the right to vote wasn't ratified until 1920. Colorado is now first again, the first state via decision from its Supreme Court to say Donald Trump's actions as president, specifically during the Capitol riot on January 6th, met the legal standard of insurrection and therefore disqualifies him from the ballot in accordance with the 14th Amendment. This is not the last word on this particular legal matter, far from it. But the Colorado Supreme Court's decision to take the question of insurrection head on has legal, political, and moral weight that will not only shadow this holiday season, but the start of the Republican Party nominating process. And that is where we begin. CBS News Chief Election and Campaign Correspondent Robert Costa joins us now. Robert, your assessment of what the political impact and possible legal impact of the Colorado Supreme Court decision may be.
Major, for months we've been discussing the players in the 2024 presidential race, and we talk about former President Trump, former Ambassador Nikki Haley, former Governor Christie, Governor DeSantis, and so many others. But the real players right now on the campaign front are the Supreme Court justices. How will they weigh in on some of these crucial issues that are going to face him about Trump's viability as a candidate moving forward in the coming weeks? His immunity. They're going to decide on that. They're going to potentially rule on some January 6 defendants. They're going to rule on the Colorado State Supreme Court ruling. And ultimately, they'll decide whether, if Trump's convicted in the January 6 case, whether his appeal will stand or not. And so we're looking at a Supreme Court that has an immense amount of influence on the horizon.
And a collision between the law and politics happening right before our eyes, and right as people in Iowa, New Hampshire, and maybe in South Carolina will be making monumental decisions about what direction the Republican Party does or doesn't go.
And it's often an uncomfortable place for the Supreme Court to be, with the court having its institutional standing questioned repeatedly by critics in recent years. People like Justice Clarence Thomas and his wife, Ginny Thomas, her political activity has been in the spotlight from some lawmakers on Capitol Hill. Her text messages with Mark Meadows, the former White House chief of staff, reported
specifically on and about January 6th and the events leading up to it.
And you have a former president who has all these open questions that will ultimately land before the Supreme Court. The question is, does it break through with Republican voters as the voting starts to take place next year? And will it really matter in the general election? Because there is still the possibility, if the January 6 case moves forward as planned starting in March, maybe late spring, early summer, could Trump be a convicted felon and also be the nominee of a party?
A huge question, unresolved until we know for sure. Robert, I want to ask you about a poll we just saw released about an hour and a half ago. St. Anselm, a good poll in New Hampshire, respected. Here's what it says. Former President Trump, 44%, Nikki Haley, 30%, Chris Christie, 12%. That is a move up for Nikki Haley. That makes it look a bit more competitive in New Hampshire. If there is any momentum or movement, it's on the Nikki Haley side, upward, a little bit downward for former President Trump. What does this possibly suggest?
Well, it means for Nikki Haley that if she continues to rise in New Hampshire, whether she wins or loses the state, it could be her jolt that provides her with the bounds to stay in through her home state of South Carolina. It'd be a big political risk for her to stay in and lose South Carolina in a big way. So if New Hampshire gives her a lift, you can expect her to say, maybe I'll give it a roll of the dice in South Carolina, and maybe she stays in through Super Tuesday. I think back to 1992, Bill Clinton called himself the comeback kid. He didn't win New Hampshire.
Oh, he did not.
But he did well enough that it propelled him toward the nomination.
Right. Expectations matter a great deal. Is there any sense, Robert, that you have that any of this, what is going on in New Hampshire, a little bit of a lift for Nikki Haley, is translating at all in Iowa?
Nikki Haley could expect a tick up in Iowa as the weeks close. Iowa caucus goers are notoriously late for making some of their decisions. I think about Rick Santorum. It kind of broke for him in the final few days. For Mike Huckabee, the same. And so, yes, Ron DeSantis has visited 99 counties, but the Florida governor is by no means the favorite to come in second place against former President Trump. You could see Nikki Haley close strong in Iowa, and if she comes a strong second or maybe even a narrow third against DeSantis, that could really help her going into New Hampshire. But for Trump, it's about, can he have enough of a lead that he just seems like it's a foregone conclusion that he's going to be the nominee to stave off any so-called momentum for Haley?
We came in on this question of the Colorado Supreme Court. The word insurrectionist matters, and President Biden addressed that today. He was asked by reporters. Let's listen to what he had to say.
Well, I think certainly they're self-evident. You saw it all. Now, whether the 14th Amendment applies, I'll let the court make that decision. But he certainly supported an insurrection. And no question about it. None. Zero.
No question about it, Robert. None. Zero from the President of the United States, suggesting if these two are the nominees of their respective parties, this will not be something set to the side by the Biden-Harris reelection campaign.
Not at all. And the Biden presidency was forged in the wake of January 6th. His inaugural address took place just days after an attack on the Capitol where he gave those words. One of the phrases from his inaugural address was that this was a winter of peril, that this country was attacked by some of its own citizens during the certification process of an election. So Biden is always going to be in history a president connected to January 6th, the person who came after Trump, whose own election was challenged by the outgoing president who wouldn't even show up at that inauguration. So it's not surprising to see such a visceral reaction from the president himself. As much as presidents try to stay out of some of these legal matters, for the president, clearly it's political and personal.
Do you think there is any sense within the Trump campaign that this Colorado Supreme Court decision does more to continue that narrative long nursed by former President Trump all this year of being victimized by a legal process?
It could fuel that grievance, and that would be no surprise. But even if the Supreme Court weighs in on Colorado and says he's fine to be on the ballot, he's allowed to be on the ballot in other states, this idea of him being an insurrectionist before being convicted of anything regarding insurrection, if they allow him to be on the ballot, he still faces Jack Smith.
Right.
So it's not over for him if the Supreme Court says it's okay for you to be on the ballot in Colorado and elsewhere.
Not by a long stretch. Robert Costa, we thank you very much. 10 Americans detained in Venezuela have been released. The U.S., in exchange, returned a close ally of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. The White House was heavily involved in these negotiations, and President Biden said in a statement, quote, "I am grateful that their ordeal is finally over and that these families are being made whole once more." Venezuela also extradited a fugitive wanted by U.S. authorities as part of this deal. Coming up, we will speak to Colorado's Secretary of State about that historic ruling handed down by its Supreme Court, barring former President Trump, at least for the time being, from the state's ballot. You are streaming America Decides.
Well, let me start with this.
This really happened.
Have you told the government?
Did any of that make sense?
What's your response?
You want me to just
What's wrong with that argument?
What have you learned?
Do you know why?
Why? Why?
It's time for 60 Minutes, Sunday on CBS.
An original documentary from CBS Reports.
Since you started La Soup in 2014, do you have any sense as to how much food you've rescued from the landfill?
We've rescued 4.5 million pounds.
I can't even fathom how much food that is.
And that's one little person in one little city in America. We're gonna call this chicken piccata. We did 450 of these meals today.
This is the exact dish that you and I are going to have.
Yep.
Oh, my God.
Is it good? Mm-hmm. Having a plan of how to keep people fed should be in every single city.
So if we eliminated food waste, could we eliminate
hunger? Yes.
Eating Trash, now streaming on the free CBS News app. An original documentary from CBS Reports.
You had a substitute teacher that was pretty popular. What was his reputation?
Everyone loved him.
You had to miss a test. What did he offer to have you make up the test?
He said that I can come by after school was all over and just take the exam. The blinds were down. He closed the door. The next thing I knew, he was right next to me. That's when I realized what was going to happen. Even if I wanted to scream at the top of my lungs, no one would hear me because no one was there. He told me that if I ever said anything to anyone, he would kill me and he would kill my family. So I did it.
Pledge of Silence, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
He was there when the war in Ukraine started.
Extreme history. Yeah, it's a big moment.
The extraordinary story behind Sean Penn's new Paramount Plus documentary, Superpower, when we go person to person.
An original documentary from CBS Reports.
AI is among the most world-changing technologies ever.
Curing diseases, scientific breakthroughs, making lives better.
They can help us with medical discoveries, scientific discoveries, doing better agriculture, having cures for things like Alzheimer's.
It's also going to really transform the way we work.
The uplifting potential of artificial intelligence is limitless.
It gives you a friend, somebody to chat with 24/7 that is non-judgmental. He makes me feel loved and desired.
And so are its downfalls.
The problem with all this AI is that it's unpredictable and uncontrollable.
The choices we make now will have lasting effects for decades, maybe even centuries.
The ChatGPT revolution, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
It's like a screenplay, something straight out of Hollywood.
Human remains found this week.
The mystery would haunt investigators for years.
A gripping true crime original, 48 Hours, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
Welcome back to America Decides. Former President Trump says he plans to appeal the Colorado Supreme Court's decision to disqualify him from the state's ballot. Trump has until January 4th to file his appeal. Colorado Secretary of State Jenna Griswold joins us now. Madam Secretary, it's good to see you. I'm going to ask you a couple of basic questions for the benefit of our audience. Did you bring this litigation to the Colorado Supreme Court?
Thanks for having me on. And no, I did not bring this litigation.
Who did?
6 Colorado voters who are Republican or unaffiliated voters filed a lawsuit seeking a court to determine that Donald Trump is disqualified for engaging in the insurrection.
And how do you regard the Supreme Court's decision?
I agree with the Supreme Court's decision. There have been 2 courts that have looked at the substance as to whether Donald Trump engaged in an insurrection, and they both determined that he did. The Colorado Supreme Court determined also that he is barred because of his actions under Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. There shouldn't be a loophole for the president if the president decides to engage in insurrection or rebellion.
And how do you regard the dissent in the split opinion? It was 4-3 on the Colorado Supreme Court. One of the dissenting justices said the former president was denied due process because he hasn't been tried and convicted of a charge of insurrection.
Historically, a criminal conviction was not required to be disqualified under Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. Now, Section 3 of the 14th Amendment says that any person who swears to uphold the Constitution and then subsequently engages in insurrection or rebellion cannot hold office. It was put into place after the Civil War during Reconstruction and was used to remove hundreds of Confederate soldiers and officials. And there has not been a history of requiring a criminal prosecution. It does, this case has a court case. It's had 2 court cases, a district court and now the Colorado Supreme Court.
What are the implications for Colorado voters in terms of the upcoming Super Tuesday Colorado primary?
At this point, Donald Trump is disqualified from the Colorado ballot. Now, Trump has indicated he will appeal the case to the United States Supreme Court. And when he does that, he becomes qualified again, and the United States Supreme Court can determine whether they take the case and what they decide in the case, of course.
And if the Supreme Court takes the case, but also, if you'll allow me, takes its time and doesn't offer an opinion one way or the other before January 5th, what happens to Donald Trump's name in regards to the upcoming primary?
If this case is appealed and the United States Supreme Court takes the case, Donald Trump will be presumed eligible on the ballot. I do believe that if the United States Supreme Court takes the case, there is a high likelihood that they may not resolve the whole case by January 5th when I certify the ballot, but there's a high likelihood that they'll act in some capacity. But just like you, we have to hold tight and see if the appeals process moves forward. But as of right now, Donald Trump is disqualified from the ballot in the state of Colorado.
Madam Secretary, I've talked to a couple of constitutional lawyers about this who don't have a political point of view one way or the other, but they say one thing the U.S. Supreme Court might do is say, well, you know, Section 3 of the 14th Amendment doesn't specifically say president or vice president, therefore it doesn't apply. Therefore, the Colorado Supreme Court case can be overturned, that ruling can be overturned, simply because the plain language of Section 3 of the 14th Amendment doesn't apply, and we're going to override on that basis. Do you think that is possible?
There are a lot of arguments out there by legal scholars that lean progressive and conservative, who are not in agreement with each other. It is possible the Supreme Court goes down that path. It's also possible that the Supreme Court affirms the Colorado State Supreme Court in determining Trump is ineligible. Look, Donald Trump incited the insurrection. He tried to stop the peaceful transfer of the presidency, trying to steal the presidential election from the American people. In Section 3 of the 14th Amendment has clear language. So I do believe the Colorado Supreme Court got it right. But unlike Donald Trump, I will follow whatever court decision is in place, the law, the U.S. Constitution, when it comes time to certify the election.
I wonder, Madam Secretary, if you have a reaction to some of the Republicans who I've seen quoted saying this decision is anti-democratic and disenfranchises voters. Do you find any irony in that?
Yes, it's ironic because Donald Trump literally tried to steal the presidency. That is the only reason that this case moved forward, because of his actions. So I think at the end of the day, we all need to follow the law in the United States Constitution. And it's Donald Trump's failure to do that that got us into this place in the first to start with. When it comes down to it, the provision that would bar someone who has engaged in rebellion or insurrection is there to protect the United States government, to protect this country from a threat from within. So we are seeing the judicial process play out. That is democratic for a court case to move forward. And it's also democratic to listen to whatever court's decisions come forward on the issue.
The Colorado Republican Party said today that if this ruling by the Supreme Court of Colorado is upheld, it will shift to a caucus. Is there any problem with that?
Yes, there is not the ability to cancel a presidential primary because a political party wants to cancel it. So when we're talking about undemocratic tendencies, Colorado overwhelmingly voted to have presidential primaries. So that will move forward. And I think if there is an effort to try to thwart the will of the people in the presidential primary, there's a good likelihood there will be lawsuits filed and further litigation.
So if it shifts to caucus, there will be litigation over that very question.
There is not the ability to cancel a presidential primary in the state of Colorado because a political party wants to do a caucus.
Understood.
So that's not legal.
Understood. This will be a simple question, but I just want to help our audience. Does the Supreme Court decision in Colorado cover both the primary ballot and the general election ballot? I know one follows the other, but I just want to clarify that point from your understanding, Madam Secretary.
But that's a really good question. And I think if Donald Trump is disqualified on the presidential primary, there's a high likelihood that another court case would be filed for the general. But at the end of the day, if the Colorado Supreme Court has already determined that he's disqualified for the presidential primary, it is very likely that the same determination would be made in the general. But we, before all those hypotheticals play out, we have to see if the United States Supreme Court decides to take the case.
The 39th Secretary of the State of Colorado, Secretary of State, rather, of the State of Colorado, Jenna Griswold. Thank you so very much for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Next, the latest on President Biden's re-election bid and his appeals to mobilize minority voters. You are streaming America Decides.
An original documentary from CBS reports.
It was genocide, a deliberate effort by the United States government to eliminate the food source that was relied upon by Native American tribes.
American bison were slaughtered and Native Americans displaced.
And that's how tribes were subjugated to reservations and our lands were taken.
But now, through conservation efforts at Yellowstone,
Buffalo provided everything that we needed. Now they need help.
a herd grows
We need to step up and help them.
and a culture is reborn.
When the buffalo return and come back, that's when our tribe will begin to heal.
Yellowstone Bison Revival, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
She is a beloved American icon and head of a media empire. But is Oprah Winfrey happy? How do you define happiness?
Yeah, I call it happiness.
Find out when we go person to person.
An original documentary from CBS reports.
That desired farm is a wonderful place to raise children, and it still is.
Promises broken.
Black Americans have been the target of racism and discrimination pretty much from the time they acquired ownership in the land.
Costing black farmers hundreds of billions in generational wealth.
They did everything to make sure we were run off that land.
But communities are uniting to continue the fight.
Collective ownership is powerful.
To keep their land and their dreams alive.
To watch my children play on land that we own means everything.
So land is power.
Most definitely.
40 Acres and a Mule, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
She's a country music legend, philanthropist, fashion icon, and now rock star.
I think there's a lot to be said about being comfortable with who you are.
Find out what's next for Dolly Parton when we go person to person.
There is no more room in our city.
New York City is receiving record numbers of migrants.
Today, we're going to have more than 500 adults and children come through that door.
Tensions rise as shelters reach max capacity.
We don't have to take care of them.
CBS Reports goes inside a crisis cities and families are facing as they fight to survive.
The United States still has that glimmer of hope for people to come here.
Fighting for a future, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
Hey there, welcome to The Uplift.
I thought she was a groom, and I stepped back and I went, oh, you're the queen. She's going to be with me every instant that I'm alive.
I just wanted to see if you'd go to Disneyland with me today.
I look over at him and he's smiling.
I'm going to remember that the rest of my life.
They told us when he was going to be born, he was only going to live for 30 minutes. It's really a miracle that he's with us today.
The Uplift, stream now on the free CBS News app.
Across the country, wages for workers are up. Black wealth is up record 60% since the pandemic. So many of you, look, and by the way, I mean this sincerely from the bottom of my heart, we're just getting started.
Welcome back to America Decides. That, of course, was President Biden today in Milwaukee, talking about his economic policies and suggesting that they have worked out well for minority Americans. He also criticized former President Trump. We'll talk about all of that with Leslie Sanchez and Chuck Roach. They join us now. Leslie, CBS News political analyst who served in the George W. Bush administration. Chuck is the president of Solidarity Strategies and was an advisor to Bernie Sanders' 2020 presidential campaign. Leslie, I want to talk to you first about This poll in New Hampshire, St. Anselm, it's consistent, and we should talk about this for just a second. CBS News polling was the first to capture this momentum for Nikki Haley, now captured in a second poll. What does that tell you about at least New Hampshire and Nikki Haley's potential prospects there?
I think it speaks a lot about New Hampshire. I mean, New Hampshire has a lot of it. Those independent voters like to be the ones that test the mettle of these candidates. They take that role very seriously. She has tremendous appeal among women, suburban women, college-educated women, Christian women. I mean, you go down the line, but women are really falling in line and building a big part of that support. And also you have that base that's looking for alternatives. They like what they see. She has been tested, and I feel that reflects that. I don't know if it's going to go much further than that, but it reflects it.
Anyone doing simple math sees right now, Trump at 44, Haley 30, Christie 12, according to that poll. You put Christie and Haley together, that's 42, that's neck and neck. Does this in any way increase the pressure or the questions about Christie staying in this race and not backing Haley?
Not for Christie. I think he's going to just ride it to the end. I mean, he's ride or die. He's
in New Hampshire.
In New Hampshire, and probably as far as he can go, even with very few. He's running on fumes anyway. But I mean, he's just going to keep that.
Chuck, as a Democrat who is eyeing this very closely, do you see any instability in the Trump inevitability narrative?
I mean, not really, but anything could happen. I'm also somebody that said Donald Trump could never be president, so welcome to my party, right? So, like, I never say never no more. So anything could happen. Every time something happens to him, it seems to just help him. When Democrats are like, well, if he gets convicted or if he gets indicted, it's going to hurt. Well, he raises more money, he gets more popular. So I quit saying never a long time ago, but I think this interesting thing in New Hampshire that y'all are talking about is something to keep an eye on, because if this thing gets whittled down and it is Nikki Haley, I think she is a real threat.
I want to play something that President Biden said today in regard to something that former President Trump has said not just once, but twice, and drawn tremendous attention and condemnation. Let's listen to the president.
We always believe diversity is our strength as a nation. I don't believe, as the former president said again yesterday, that immigrants are polluting our blood.
The actual quote is poisoning our blood. Chuck, the president is zeroing in on this. The Democratic Party will zero on this for historical reasons, for political reasons, and just for temperamental reasons. Like, what are we talking about?
Right. And I think that there's a reason for that, and that's because we are so reliant on minority voters to have a successful election. Let's keep in mind, we keep talking about the slippage of Latino voters, the slippage of black voters. He needs to win black voters at 90%. He needs to win probably 60 or 65% of Latinos. That's why he's doubling down right now and talking about this language, which is a free gift to him, because we're a nation of immigrants. And I don't care if you didn't come from Africa or from Mexico, or if you came from Ireland or you came from Italy, we're all a nation of immigrants. And I think that hits the core of a lot of voters who are proud of their immigrant roots, who may not be from the countries we talk about every day on the TV.
But Chuck, you would acknowledge there is frustration in this country about the president's immigration policies. Independence, it shows up again and again and again. And about a quarter of Democrats are dissatisfied, and almost all Republicans are.
It's because we have a system that's been broken for a long time. Right, wrong, or indifferent, it's been broken. It's been broken since 9/11 and going back further than that. And when we've tried to fix it, there's been one stalwart plan after another that's just failed. And that blame goes to both parties, to be honest, because we both use it to our own advantage, I think wrongly many times.
Leslie, your thoughts on poisoning the blood of our nation?
Well, I think if you think back to the previous, 2016, Mexican immigrants were the piñata, when it came to looking at anybody that was crossing the border illegally. I mean, it is part of the MO of what the president does, and drawing that contrast. What's distinctly different, and I think Chuck is really important to that, immigration is not going to be the one issue that's driving minority voters, particularly Latino voters. It's going to be the economic issues. And you're seeing tremendous slippage, even in places that the president is today, for example, Milwaukee. The latest poll has him 6 to 10 points down in a state that he won.
Wisconsin.
Yeah, exactly. And you're talking about 180,000 or so unregistered Latinos. He won by a little less than 25,000. People are adding those numbers up and saying there's opportunity.
Does former President Trump's rhetoric, this is a different kind of rhetoric. It has a historical, fascistic, Mussolini, Hitler cast to it. Is that problematic for those voters who are on the fence or maybe leaning Trump?
It really...
Does it push them away?
It depends who you're talking about. I tell you, I've tested messages like that, specifically those quotes. And if you look at Latino voters who are either right of center or maybe left of center, they're going to say that's not really what they're listening to. That's just kind of the bombastic nature of Donald Trump. And it's amazing that, and Chuck and I were saying never say never, what Trump gets away with in terms of something no other candidate could say, but he has such a distinct appeal around his persona that those particular attacks really land flat.
So, Chuck, in order for President Biden and Kamala Harris, the vice president, to make this stick, they've got to drive it harder. Is that true?
Right, because let's be clear what Donald Trump's doing. Donald Trump has lost suburban America. And so he's got to go find new voters to bring them in. People underreported in 2020. He had more people vote for him than voted for him 4 years prior to. And he needs even more if he's going to win because he's lost support of what I would call common sense, middle class Republican women in the suburbs and other folks like that. So he needs to use this rhetoric to motivate new people, whatever that motivation may be, to get new folks to show up that will say anything.
Do you think there's a real percentage in that, using this kind of rhetoric to reach deeper into other parts that are non-suburban, non-exurban, non-urban?
There's a group of voters out there that are frustrated and new voters who just want to see the whole thing burnt down, whether that's our government or whether that's whatever, because they think the whole system is broken. I think that that's very scary for our democracy, but that exists in our democracy.
Chuck Roach, Leslie Sanchez, thank you so much for your time. That does it for today. You know this, but I'm just going to remind you ever so quickly. You're streaming CBS News.
Original documentary from CBS reports tensions rising between a powerful country and a vital island.
The supply of this technology came grinding to a halt. The world would grind to a halt.
Absolutely. As Taiwan faces threats and aggression,
Taiwan is